The lights above the Dallas convention stage burned bright, but the tension in the room burned brighter. Business moguls, investors, and media elites had gathered for what was billed as the most exclusive innovation panel of the year. The room buzzed with curated conversations and veiled egos until the doors at the back opened and Karoline Leavitt stepped in. She didn't belong here. At least that's what the invitation list suggested. She wasn't a billionaire. She wasn't a tech founder. And she certainly wasn't part of the elite club that had gathered under the soft glow of chandeliers and corporate bravado. But Karoline walked in anyway, head high, shoulders squared, and wearing a deep blue blazer that said she came with purpose, not permission. Mark Cuban, seated center stage, glanced up from his notes, his eyes locking onto hers with a flicker of irritation. He leaned toward the mic, voice calm but laced with condescension. "Did someone let the campaign kids in here?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed. Karoline didn't blink. She took her seat at the panel table, reserved, ironically, for rising voices in leadership. The irony wasn't lost on her. The moderator, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over. "Let's welcome Karoline Leavitt, former White House press secretary and, well, a rising voice, clearly." It was meant as a compliment. It sounded like a question. Mark Cuban leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms. "Let's just hope she knows what she's talking about." That was it. No one laughed this time. Karoline smiled, just slightly. She turned toward Cuban, her tone steady, her words chosen like surgical strikes. "I may not be worth $1 billion, but I've stood in rooms that required more than money, rooms that demanded backbone." A murmur swept the room. Mark's eyebrow twitched, but she wasn't finished. "And if we're talking about leadership," she continued, now facing the audience, "maybe we should ask, is it about fortune or about the future?" The audience, once cold, now watched with sharper interest. Something had shifted. Cuban leaned forward, lips parting for a reply, but whatever he was going to say got lost in the applause rising from the crowd's right flank. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just in the room. She had just taken it. The break between panels had barely begun when Mark Cuban cornered her. "You know this isn't Washington, right?" he said, his voice low, calculated, like a man who'd had too much press and too little pushback. "This is a space for innovators, builders, not politicians with sound bites." Karoline didn't flinch. She sipped her water, calmly placed the cup down, and met his gaze like she'd met worse from reporters and political opponents alike. "Good," she said. "Then I won't need to build a narrative. Just tell the truth." Cuban's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected that. He turned to walk away, but not before muttering something into his mic, assuming it was off. "She's just noise." But his mic was on. The room froze. A few guests gasped. Phones came out. Live stream feeds caught it. The words echoed louder than he had intended, and Karoline knew it. She turned to face the audience again, stepping up to the edge of the stage like someone reclaiming territory. "Did you hear that?" she said calmly, her voice rising just enough. "I'm not a CEO, not a mogul, but today I represent every young person who's been told they're just noise, every woman who's been spoken over, every leader who didn't come from wealth, but came with something more powerful." Cuban stood frozen. Karoline paused, scanning the room slowly. "I was told I didn't belong, that I'm too young, too conservative, too faith-driven to be taken seriously. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Applause. Real, growing, relentless. A tech founder on the second row stood, then another. The moderator, flustered, tried to bring the moment back to order. Let's return to the subject of innovation and future leadership," she offered weakly. Karoline nodded, stepping back toward the table. "Exactly what I'm here to discuss." Cuban forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The moment had slipped, and everyone knew it. He reached for his notepad, scribbling something, maybe a deflection, maybe a strategy. But for the first time that day, Mark Cuban wasn't driving the conversation. Karoline was. By the time the panel resumed, something about the energy in the room had shifted, noticeably, irreversibly. Karoline wasn't just holding her own, she was setting the tone. Her answers were crisp, her presence composed. And though Cuban tried to redirect the conversation to topics where he held leverage, venture capital, startup equity, exit strategy, Karoline found her footing on every curve. But it was during the audience Q&A that the real shift began. A woman stood up from the back, young, no older than 22, wearing a press badge from an independent media site. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Karoline, you spoke about not coming from wealth. I think a lot of people in this room assume you've always had political connections. Can you talk about your beginnings?" Mark Cuban leaned forward, intrigued. This, he thought, was the weak spot. Pull back the curtain and reveal the privilege underneath. Or maybe, nothing worth hearing. But Karoline didn't dodge. She turned toward the young woman with a nod of appreciation, and then began. "I grew up in a working-class family in New Hampshire. My dad was a small business owner. My mom worked nights in a hospital. We didn't have political connections. We had faith, grit, and a small house with drafty windows and a lot of love." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "My first campaign job wasn't glamorous. I was printing flyers at 2 a.m. in a basement office that smelled like burnt coffee. I got told no more times than I can count, but every time I did, I just worked harder." Murmurs in the crowd. Eyes shifted from Cuban to her. "And when I finally stood at that White House podium," she continued, her voice rising with quiet authority, "I wasn't thinking about power. I was thinking about my mom watching from that tiny living room in New Hampshire, finally seeing someone like us up there." A man in a blazer and designer loafers, seated 2 rows in front of Cuban, leaned over and whispered to his colleague, "This is leadership, not legacy." Cuban caught it. His jaw tightened. Karoline smiled faintly, not smug, but certain. "So no, I didn't come from a dynasty. But I did come from something stronger." Real-life applause broke out. Not a standing ovation, but something deeper. Respect. The moderator cleared her throat, clearly rethinking which panelist had the momentum. "Thank you, Karoline. That was powerful." Cuban interjected. "Let's not confuse sentiment with strategy." Karoline turned her gaze on him like a spotlight. "Sometimes the future isn't built by strategy," she said. "It's built by those who were never supposed to be part of it, but showed up anyway." And for the second time that day, Mark Cuban had no reply. That evening, the energy in the post-panel networking lounge was electric. Laughter, clinking glasses, flashes from press photographers, yet all eyes occasionally darted toward the same pair of figures across the room, Karoline Leavitt and Mark Cuban. Their exchange on stage had already gone viral, but Karoline wasn't done. Back in her hotel suite, modest compared to Cuban's penthouse, she flipped open her laptop. The screen glowed with bookmarked articles, archived interviews, and transcripts. She had a plan, not to get even, but to illuminate. She knew Cuban's Achilles heel wasn't arrogance, it was contradiction. She rewatched his 2016 speech on entrepreneurship, one that contradicted everything he said on stage hours earlier. A speech in which he praised non-traditional thinkers, outsiders who disrupt norms, and people who challenge the room, even when they don't fit in. She clipped it. Then she found an op-ed Cuban had written during the 2020 election cycle. He'd slammed political appointees for being too polished, too scripted. "Real leadership doesn't come from polish. It comes from perspective," he'd written. She clipped that too. The next morning, the final keynote aired live on business news channels. And surprise, Karoline had been added to the lineup overnight, thanks to a rising flood of online interest. Cuban looked less amused than usual when he saw her seated across from him on stage. The moderator, sensing the tension, smiled nervously. "Karoline, you've generated quite the discussion. Final thoughts before we close out this year's summit?" Karoline's response was measured, but devastating. "You know," she began, "I've heard a lot about who belongs in rooms like this, about what qualifies someone to lead." She glanced at Cuban, then held up a printed page. "Mark, This is your 2016 speech, where you said the best leaders are often those who don't fit the mold. Outsiders, non-traditional voices. You encourage them to keep going, to disrupt. The audience stirred. Cuban shifted in his seat. And this, she continued, holding up another printout, is your op-ed from 2020, where you criticized polished insiders and praised those who speak with perspective over polish. You said real leadership was raw. She folded both papers and placed them on the table. So, which version of you should we listen to? The one that praised people like me? Or the one who tried to dismiss me as just noise? Gasps rippled across the room. Cuban opened his mouth, but the moderator raised a hand. Let her finish. Karoline did. I'm not here to score points. I'm here because I believe the future of leadership is being redefined, and that future doesn't belong to the loudest wallet, but to the clearest voice. Applause erupted, this time a standing ovation. Cuban sat frozen, not humiliated, just outplayed. Karoline had done her homework. She hadn't attacked him. She'd simply held up a mirror. And what the room saw changed everything. The clip of Karoline calmly quoting Mark Cuban to his face exploded online. It trended within an hour. Major outlets picked it up with headlines like, Karoline Leavitt outsmarts Mark Cuban on live stage. From dismissed to dominant, Karoline turns the tables. Mark Cuban wasn't used to losing control of a narrative, especially not to someone half his age, and certainly not on his own turf. So that night, he did what most billionaires with bruised egos and media access do. He went on air. Cuban appeared on a primetime interview, smirking as always, but with an edge this time. Look, he said, I respect the ambition. But we shouldn't confuse well-rehearsed zingers with real substance. It's easy to score points when you cherry-pick quotes out of context. He leaned in, a subtle dig ready. She's talented, no doubt, but this isn't the White House. This is the real world. You need more than slogans to build something that lasts. Karoline saw it live. She sat still in her suite, hands folded in her lap. No reaction, just quiet focus. She didn't need to rage tweet. She didn't need to post a clever clip. She waited. And then the emails started. From young professionals, business owners, even former Cuban collaborators. You spoke for us. He's been untouchable too long. Thanks for saying what we couldn't. The next morning, Karoline was invited to speak on a podcast that catered to millennial entrepreneurs. She didn't mention Cuban by name. She didn't have to. When people say you need more than slogans, she said, ask them what they've actually built that helped the everyday American. She smiled, her tone unwavering. I come from where people work double shifts and still can't afford rent. Where kids pray for heat in the winter. So if clarity and courage are slogans, I'll wear them with pride. The clip racked up over 2 million views in 24 hours. Back at Cuban's camp, his advisors were split. You're just feeding her popularity, one said. Another warned, she's turning your words into her weapon. And it was true. Mark had tried to reassert dominance with condescension, but Karoline turned it into momentum. She wasn't fighting fire with fire. She was lighting a torch others could rally around. By the end of the week, a poll from a major outlet asked, who won the summit? Karoline Leavitt, 68%. Mark Cuban, 23%. The rest? Undecided. And in those undecided minds, Karoline had just planted a seed. The email arrived at 7:41 a.m. Subject line, invite, CNBC Roundtable. Future of Leadership Panel. Karoline read it twice. She wasn't surprised. After all, her name had been buzzing across business circles for a week. But what caught her eye was the guest list. Mark Cuban. Again. Except this time, he wasn't the moderator. He wasn't the anchor voice. He was another panelist. Equal footing. Karoline smiled. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she knew something had shifted. She no longer needed to fight for a seat at the table. Now people were asking if the table even mattered without her. The day of the round table, the set was sleek. Walls of LED, cityscape views, high-definition everything. Karoline wore a crisp white blazer with navy trim, her silver cross necklace resting neatly at the collarbone. Calm, composed. Cuban walked in later than the others, sunglasses still on. When he saw her already mic'd up and chatting with the CNBC host, his grin faded just slightly. The camera rolled. The host opened with the predictable, "We're joined by a powerhouse group today. Let's talk about how leadership is evolving in a divided America." Cuban took the bait early. "Look, leadership today requires real-world experience, not just rhetoric, not media soundbites or political talking points." Karoline didn't flinch. When her turn came, she leaned forward. "Real-world experience matters, absolutely. But real leadership is being able to listen, not just lead when it's easy, but when you're being questioned, challenged, doubted." She glanced at Cuban, not accusingly, but pointed. "Especially by those who assume they've seen more, simply because they've lived longer." The host raised an eyebrow. "Is that directed at someone?" Karoline smiled faintly. "If the suit fits." Laughter broke across the room. Even one of the other panelists, an investor in his 60s, nodded in approval. The discussion continued. At one point, Cuban jumped in. "You know, I built my empire from nothing. No handouts, no legacy invites." Karoline responded smoothly. "And you should be proud of that, Mark. Just like I'm proud I made it from New Hampshire to the White House without a trust fund. Different routes. Same lesson. No one has a monopoly on hard work." This time, there were cheers. Not just polite agreement, but genuine admiration. Viewers watching from home could sense it. The girl Cuban once mocked for not belonging? She now owned the room. Her arguments weren't louder. They were sharper. Her presence didn't demand respect. It commanded it. And most importantly, she didn't just answer Cuban. She redefined the conversation. As the CNBC lights dimmed and the credits rolled, the panelists exchanged polite goodbyes. The set emptied out gradually. Staff resetting cameras, guests heading to green rooms. Karoline remained seated a few extra seconds, finishing a quick follow-up note on her phone. Cuban watched her from the side, then gestured toward the hallway. "Got a minute?" She stood, nodded. They walked side by side down a glass-paneled corridor. The noise from the set faded behind them. Ahead, a quiet backstage lounge. Cool, dimly lit, far from the buzz of the media frenzy outside. Karoline folded her arms calmly. "Go ahead." Cuban didn't waste time. "You're good. I'll give you that. But be careful. This whole smart conservative woman with bite thing. People love it until you slip. And you will." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you think I haven't slipped before?" He shrugged. "Because no one's aired it yet." She didn't smile. "That's the difference between you and me. You're afraid of exposure. I don't care. I've already been underestimated, mocked, dismissed, and I'm still standing." Cuban chuckled dryly. "Yeah, but don't confuse going viral with being right." Karoline stepped closer, just enough to lower her voice without losing presence. "And don't confuse money with wisdom. You've got a brand. I've got a backbone." He leaned against the counter, expression tightening. "You're making enemies fast," he muttered. "I'm not here to be liked," she replied, her tone like ice under pressure. "I'm here to tell the truth, even if it rattles billionaires." The air between them thickened. Then, unexpectedly, Cuban looked away and exhaled. "You remind me of me, before the cameras, before the comfort, when I actually believed this stuff mattered." Karoline didn't blink. "Maybe that's why you hate me." He met her eyes, and for the first time, the smug armor slipped. Maybe. They stood in silence, not as enemies, but as opposites forced to recognize each other. And that's when Karoline said it. Not for effect, not for applause. Just the truth. "Mark, this isn't a game for me. I'm not playing a part. I'm not rehearsing zingers backstage. I've lived every line I say." She turned toward the exit. "But if you want to keep trying me, just know, I don't blink." Cuban didn't follow. He just watched her walk away. And in that moment, for the first time since their battle began, he realized something unnerving. He hadn't rattled her. He'd awakened her, Karoline's stride down the CNBC hallway wasn't just a walk off a set. It was a statement. And the world noticed. Within hours, the behind-the-scenes moment, caught in a leaked clip from a stage assistant's phone, went viral. Not because she yelled, not because she was theatrical, but because she was real. Her line, "I've lived every line I say," spread like wildfire. "She doesn't blink" began trending on X by midnight. Young conservatives posted clips of her from the summit. Feminist accounts, unexpectedly, shared quotes about not needing approval to lead. Even centrists began commenting, "Whether you agree with her or not, she's fearless." That's leadership. By morning, political podcasts, business panels, and youth platforms were buzzing with analysis. One comment from a business school professor stood out: "We're witnessing the emergence of a new archetype. Call it the combat authentic." Karoline Leavitt isn't rising despite the heat. She's rising because she embraces it. Back at the White House press room, Karoline walked in as usual, not a changed woman, but a revealed one. Cameras clicked as reporters whispered. A CNN journalist leaned toward her during the break. "You know they're calling you the anti-Cuban now?" Karoline smirked. "If by that they mean I don't sell out, guilty." She didn't gloat. She didn't soften. She just showed up. The one trait the public now associated with her more than any policy or slogan. Outside the digital world, something else was shifting too. A group of young college leaders from Virginia sent her an open letter titled, "We Don't Blink Either." They'd launched a campus leadership initiative in her name focused on intellectual courage, spiritual grounding, and economic independence. It had over 2,000 signups in 48 hours. Mark Cuban, for his part, remained silent. No tweets, no statements. Just one photo from a business roundtable. His smile thinner than usual, eyes darker. In private circles, his team floated the idea of reaching out to Karoline for a reconciliation event. Maybe a fireside talk on generational leadership. Her response? A polite but firm, "not interested." Because Karoline wasn't building a brand on moments. She was building a movement on meaning. And while most public figures crave the camera, she had mastered something rarer. She made silence speak. 2 days after the CNBC panel aired, Karoline's press team sorted through the mountain of emails, DMs, letters, and forwarded news coverage that had flooded in from across the country. Most were praise, some were attacks, a few were just noise. But one envelope, handwritten, stamped from Indiana, stood out. It was from a 16-year-old girl named Lily Rawlins. Karoline opened it slowly at her desk after the daily briefing, the late afternoon sun stretching across the White House carpet like a silent observer. "Dear Ms. Leavitt, you don't know me, but I watched you on CNBC. I saw you stand up to Mark Cuban. I saw the way you didn't flinch, and I cried. My mom always said girls like us shouldn't talk back. We should smile more. Keep our heads down. I believed her, until you. You didn't blink. You didn't shrink. You didn't ask for permission to lead. You just did. So I'm starting something. It's small, just 5 of us right now. We meet after school in the library. We talk about leadership and how to stand up for our values without being afraid. We call it the No Blink Club. You changed something in me. You made me brave. Thank you. Love." Lily Karoline blinked, slowly this time, not from fear, but from the sudden sting behind her eyes. It wasn't that the letter was unusually poetic. It wasn't even about the club. It was that she saw her younger self in Lily's shaky handwriting. The girl who once wondered if anyone would ever take her seriously. The girl who prayed at night that her voice wouldn't just echo, but matter. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a leather-bound journal where she kept her most personal notes. Then she called her communications director. "I want to go to Indiana," she said. He paused. "Indiana?" "Yep, I'm not announcing it. No press, just me. And the girl who doesn't blink." The next week, without cameras or fanfare, Karoline showed up at a quiet high school in Marion, Indiana. The principal had cleared a room. 5 teenage girls sat in a circle, nervously checking the door. When Karoline walked in, the room froze. Lily gasped. Karoline smiled, pulled up a chair, and said the words they would remember for the rest of their lives. "You don't need anyone's permission to be heard. You just need your own courage. They talked for over an hour. No filters, no scripts, just truth. And when Karoline left, the No Blink Club had tripled in size. Karoline stood backstage at the National Youth Summit in Nashville, 1 week after her quiet visit to Indiana. She wasn't the keynote speaker. At least she wasn't supposed to be. But word of her unannounced visit to Lily Rawlins's high school had spread, first among educators, then youth leaders, and finally to media outlets desperate to frame her not just as a political figure, but as a generational voice. The summit organizers had moved things around, shifted panels, cleared the slot before closing remarks. And now, under a ceiling of bright spotlights, the crowd waited. Not just with curiosity, but with expectation. Karoline looked down at the card she'd brought. It had just 2 words written on it: no blink. She stepped into the light, her voice calm, but this time, something more. There was a quiet fire behind every word. I never wanted a movement, she began. I never chased cameras. I never asked to be the answer to anyone's doubts. But I know what it's like to be 16, sitting in a room full of noise and wondering if your voice can survive it. She paused, scanning the thousands before her. A girl in Indiana reminded me that courage is contagious, and it doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from choosing to speak before you know you'll be heard. Applause swelled, first polite, then surging. You don't have to be loud to lead. You don't have to be rich, or old, or perfect. You just have to be ready. And you have to mean what you say. Now the room leaned in. Even the most skeptical eyes softened. They say I don't belong. They say I'm too young, too faithful, too honest. And to them, I say, watch me. The audience erupted. Teens stood. Teachers clapped. And somewhere backstage, the summit's head organizer turned to a staffer and whispered, "We just watched history bend a little." The next morning, Karoline's entire speech was broadcast on major networks and uploaded to YouTube. Within hours, clips from the talk had surpassed 1 million views. Lily's No Blink Club swelled to over 10,000 members in a week. Schools from coast to coast requested to start chapters, and across platforms, one phrase echoed like a drumbeat. She doesn't blink, and neither will we. Some moments aren't about making a statement. They're about becoming one. Karoline Leavitt didn't ask for applause. She asked for courage. And in doing so, she gave it back to a new generation. If her story inspired you, if you've ever doubted whether you belong in the room, remember this: you don't need permission to lead. You just need to stop blinking. Subscribe to Surprising Stories, because the world needs fewer rehearsed lines and more real ones.